Hi, welcome back to Dough Try This at Home. My name is Nick Smith, and today we're going to be making banana bread. And one of the reasons I chose banana bread is because it is something that I think a lot of first-time or new bakers are willing to try. Uh, it's referred to as a quick bread, and quick breads are called that because instead of having to deal with yeast and letting things rise and forming dough and things like that, you just mix the ingredients together and you have chemical leavening that is going to cause your bread to rise and bake. So it's a product that you can from start to finish have ready in about an hour and a half, as opposed to maybe 3 or 4 hours for some basic yeast breads. That is going to be our project for today. But before we get started, I just wanted to talk a few things about baking and recipes in general. You know, when you first tackle a recipe, I think it's really important to read it all the way through a few times. Not just, so that you know what ingredients you need, obviously that is critical, but also that, the steps that are going to be required, if there's, some inactive time where you have to let something sit, what temperature your oven is going to be on, what pan you need. All those things are really important to have everything together and to have a plan of attack in your head before you jump into a recipe and really start cooking. And some recipes are written can be a little confusing. Like for example, maybe it calls for a cup of water, but you use part of that water in one step of the recipe and part of that water in another step of the recipe. So if you haven't familiarized yourself with the recipe, you might find running through it, you dump in the whole cup of water, and then in the next two steps you realize you made a mistake. And some mistakes they can be salvaged, and sometimes it's a lot more difficult to undo addition of ingredients and things like that. So I really encourage you to just have that habit of reading the recipe a few times and getting yourself mentally prepared to tackle it. So for today's banana bread, I just want to talk about a few specific ingredients. So we're going to use, I'm going to use all-purpose flour today. This is a tender bread. You want something that's tender. So you do not want to use a bread flour. And we talked last time about a lot of the different kinds of flours out there. So you don't want to use a bread flour. You don't want gluten to really develop in this recipe. You also don't want to use a self-rising flour. There may be banana breads out there that where you can use self-rising flour. You may be able to figure out a substitution, but our recipe is just all-purpose flour. Now there is that thing called cake flour that usually comes in a box. You can use that if you want to. But just be sure to read the packaging, because sometimes cake flour will tell you, the boxes will tell you that if you're substituting a cup of cake flour for a cup of all-purpose flour, you may need to add like 2 tablespoons of cake flour to make that substitution equal, because it's a finer product. Sometimes it's been sifted before it's been packaged, so it doesn't necessarily have the exact same measuring outcomes of regular flour. And I want to talk to you about measuring, because in the biscuit recipe, when we had our wet dough, it might have been too wet, and then we put it on a floured countertop, and we were able to compensate for that. But here, we're really making a batter, and it's going to be critical for all the ingredients to be accurately measured, because you're not going to have that chance to fix anything before it goes into the oven, really. And I'm going to put up a picture of this because I measured out the amount of flour we're going to use today. And one I just tapped on the countertop to settle it, and the other one I didn't. And you're going to see, the level is very, very different. So, I like to weigh flour when I measure. I think that's the gold standard. So for a cup and a half, that would be 180 grams of flour. So I measured that out, and what you see in this picture is 180 grams of flour in each container, but you have one container where the level is much lower than the other container. And I know that's, weighing can be kind of a pain. A lot of people don't want to deal with it. We typically, in the US, we measure by volume when we measure flour in cups. So I'm going to show you a way to measure your flour where you're going to be getting pretty decent results, because the problem is if you just take your scoop and force it down in that bag and cram a bunch of flour in there, you're going to get a very different measurement than if you weigh it, or if you do some other methods. So you want to be mindful of that, because in this recipe the accurate measurement of flour is going to be important. And I also want to talk about bananas, since this is banana nut bread. So I'm going to be using these bananas. They are black. And as bananas ripen and over-ripen, they continue to develop sugar. So this is a really great recipe. If you've got a banana that's, you didn't get to during the week and it's sitting around on the counter, you don't want to throw it away, but you don't want to put it in your smoothie either. This is a great recipe to use those up. And you can, maybe you've got some of these and you're not going to make banana bread now, but you might in a few weeks. Peel the banana and put the banana in the freezer. But make sure to peel it first, throw it in the freezer, throw it in the bag, throw it in the freezer, and then when you're ready to make your banana bread, you can just thaw it out and use it. So that's the bananas. I know I personally am not crazy. I like my bananas a little on the underripe side, so once they get a significant amount of spotting, for me, they're going to be used for banana nut bread or something else. So another important thing about reading the recipe is you're going to have to identify your pan and get it prepared, because you don't want to have everything ready to go in the oven and then you're scrambling to find a pan and get it greased and floured, or whatever the preparation method may be. You really want everything ready to go in the oven once you're done making that batter. And also you want to know your oven temperature, because you want to preheat the oven. You want to make sure that oven is nice and hot. It is ready to go when you're ready. You don't want to be waiting on the oven. You want the oven to be waiting on you. And you also want to know, some recipes will have you start something at a higher temperature and then lower it, and that's important to know as well. Here, that's not the case. We've got one temperature and our batter is going to stay in the oven for about an hour. But that's another thing that's important to know, because you've got some active time on the front end, but you're going to be waiting around for a little bit while the banana bread cooks, and you definitely want to have the right amount of time carved out so that you can complete your recipe and get a successful result. So I've already preheated my oven, and this recipe calls for nuts. I'm here in Georgia, in Atlanta, so I'm going to be using pecans. And what I want to do is toast these before I put them in the batter, because they're not going to toast once they go into the bread. So in my preheated oven at 350 degrees, I'm just going to pop these in for a few minutes and toast. All right, so let's set the timer for, let's say, 4 minutes. It'll just help them bring out the oils and smell good. So the next, we're going to need a loaf pan, and this recipe calls for a 9x5 loaf pan, which, if you want to measure, you would measure from the top of the pan. So you can see the bottom is smaller. So you're going to measure the top of the pan from the outside rim to the outside rim, and that'll, for this pan, that's 9 inches, and this is 5 inches. Not all loaf pans are created the same. Some are 8.5 inches, some are 10 inches. So it's important to know the size of your pan. Not if you have an 8.5-inch pan, you don't have to go out and buy a 9-inch pan. And if your pan is a little bit bigger, you don't have to go out and buy a pan. But it's important to know because you may need to adjust your cooking time a little bit. And the bigger pan, the batter is going to be more spread out. It'll take less time to cook, and the smaller pan, the batter is going to be more constrained. It may take a little bit longer to cook. So you'll want to know if your pan is correctly measured so that you can know whether you're going to have to maybe start checking on that bread a little bit early, or you check on it at the hour mark and it's still going to need a good bit of time, you know, maybe another 5 or 10 minutes, and that's not a surprise. Another thing is oven temperatures. Our oven temperatures may vary pretty significantly from you know, the folks who tested the recipe or created the recipe. So I always set a timer a few minutes, maybe 5, maybe 10 minutes shy of what the actual time in the recipe is, and start checking because I want to get good results. And my oven may be hotter, it may be colder than 350 degrees. You can get an oven thermometer if you want to. They're about 10-15 bucks. You can buy them on Amazon. Right now I don't have one. I've been meaning to replace one that broke, but I haven't done it. So this recipe, which is from Martha Stewart, I think it's a really great banana nut bread. For me, it gives me consistent results. I'm going to talk about that in part because some of the ingredients. But first thing, so I've got the pecans toasting in the oven, and I'm going to prepare the pan, and it says to grease the pan. So I've got a little bit of butter left over from something, and I'm just going to use the wrapper, put that butter in the pan, and just wipe that around. If you don't have butter, this recipe calls for butter, but you know, maybe it's your last stick that's going in the recipe. You can use some oil. You know, brush the oil in the pan. You know, vegetable shortening if you prefer to use that. Whatever. You just want to get the pan nice and greased, because it's going to help the bread release when it's done. So that's ready. So now, when my batter's ready, my pan is ready to go. I don't have to scramble to get anything ready. The next thing I'm going to talk about, this recipe does call for butter, but it also calls for sour cream. And I think that helps give the final product a moist, tender crumb. My experience, all butter recipes with nothing else, no other element of fat, can dry out really quickly. So I think the sour cream gives you a little bit of a cushion when you're cooking it, and to me it just turns out to be a nicer end product. Some recipes call for oil, instead of butter, and that should also give you a really nice end product. But this particular one just uses butter and sour cream. And I don't have sour cream. I'm using Greek yogurt, which is a fine substitution, or regular yogurt. So with the timer, grab a oven mitt, check on these pecans. All right, they'd probably go another 2 minutes, let's say. Okay. Now, this recipe also calls for you to sift all your dry ingredients together. So I've got a sifter that I'm going to be using. You can use, if you have a strainer, you can use that. If you don't have any of that, you can just take a whisk and whisk the dry ingredients a little bit. You know, it's not ideal, but it'll be fine. It'll get you through. So with that, let's get started.
Okay, so let's talk about the method you can use to measure your flour, because as I said, we measure flour here in the US by volume, which is not the most accurate way to do it. But this is just an example. So I've got here a measuring cup and my spoon. And so all I'm gonna do is, like, let's say this is your bag of flour. I'm gonna pick up the flour with my spoon, put it in the cup, and then this spoon has a pretty straight edge, So I'm gonna take the edge of the spoon and I'm gonna scrape off the top. So that's it. You know, if I were to just take this and compact it down and move it through, I'm going to be compacting a lot of the flour, and I'm not going to get the most accurate measurement. So in this recipe, there's a little bit of pre-work before we've got to mix the batter. So we have to sift all of our dry ingredients together. So I've got my sifter and got a bowl. I'm ready to go. So I've got 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. I have a teaspoon of baking soda. This is baking soda like Arm & Hammer. It's not baking powder. And I have a teaspoon of salt, and I'm using a pink Himalayan sea salt. I think it gives a nice little extra saltier taste to the final product, which I like. So, and then we're just gonna sift that together, which you could do with a, you know, if you had a strainer, a sieve, you could use that, or you could, at worst case scenario, just give it a whisk. So a little bit of salt there, which I'm just gonna, that's just some salt crystals. I'm gonna dump those in because those will dissolve. So that's that. Now our dry ingredients are ready to go. Now this recipe calls for it to be mixed with a mixer because you're going to cream, butter, and sugar together. So I am going to be using my KitchenAid stand mixer. You could use a hand mixer if you want to. So let's get this guy in place. Now, if you have a mixer like this, you're going to want to use the batter attachment. Sometimes it's called a K batter because it kind of looks like a letter K. You're not going to want to use a whisk or a dough hook. And then if you have just using a hand mixer, you know, you just use the beaters that come with that. So there we go. All right. Okay, so we are going to start with a stick of butter at room temperature. So it's another good reason to read your recipe ahead of time because you may need to prep some of your ingredients before you actually get started. So put this in the bowl. And also, if you wanted to, this would have been a great, the wrapper for the butter would have been a great way to grease your pan as well. And then to that, I'm going to add 1 cup of sugar. Okay, and we are going to cream the butter and sugar until they're well combined. Okay, so you can see how this is a pretty light and fluffy mixture. Scrape it down. Next, I'm going to add in my eggs. So this calls for 2 eggs. So we're going to do, here they are. So start, it's always a good idea to crack your eggs in another container in case you get a shell in or something. You can fish that out of the container instead of it getting lost in your batter. So I'm just going to get one of those in and mix it in, and then mix in the other one. All right, and here we go with the second egg. All right, there we go. Those are beautiful eggs. A neighbor, her family has a farm not far away and has been doing egg runs for the neighborhood, getting us some beautiful, beautiful eggs. Okay, so now it is time to mix in our dry ingredients that we had already sifted together. So that's the flour, the baking soda, and the salt. So put a little bit in, give it a little stir here as it comes together. And add in the rest here. Okay, and just give that a little stir. Okay, and you don't want to over stir because that is going to create gluten, which, as we've discussed, is something in these tender breads you want to avoid. So then I'm going to add in my, the recipe says half a cup of sour cream. I'm using Greek yogurt. You could use yogurt. What you want, though, is that kind of sour, acidic milk product, because that acid is gonna react with the baking soda. So I'm just gonna give that a quick stir. And then I'm gonna add in a cup of ripe bananas, which is about 2. So 2 ripe bananas would make a cup. So that goes in. And then I have a teaspoon of vanilla extract. So that also goes in. Just gonna lower it and give this a little quick whir. There we go. So just real quick, it's all, got it nice and mixed together. Take my spatula. Maybe do one more whir just to make sure. There we go. All right, and then I'm going to, I toasted my pecans and I chopped them up. So I've got about a little over half a cup of pecans that I toasted and chopped. So I am just gonna stir those in. We don't need to use the mixer anymore. So I'm gonna try to get the batter off of this. And then stir those pecans in. Okay, now take off my bowl, move the mixer out of the way. And then we have our pan that is ready to go. And I'm just going to pour the batter into the pan here. Okay, make sure we clean that bowl out as best I can. All right, and then just smooth the top a little bit to get it pushed into the corners. Just clean that little bit up on the side. I'm going to use my fingers here. Get a little batter off the spatula. Then I'm just going to tap it on the counter a little bit, just to, in case there are any air bubbles, so that those go away. Now, I think that this pan is difficult to grasp when it's in the oven, and especially once your banana bread rises and comes near the top. It's kind of hard to get a handle on this pan. So what I do is I take a little baking sheet and I set my pan on that. So then I can grab onto this to rotate the pan, put it in and out of the oven, and it's a lot easier, in my opinion, to maneuver and handle. And I think also it creates a little more of a barrier. Sometimes that bottom heating element, I've got an electric oven, and sometimes that bottom heating element is pretty intense. So I feel like sometimes my baked goods can brown on the bottom pretty significantly if that oven rack is on maybe the middle to lower part of the oven. But I've got my rack in the middle of the oven, and I've got this pan for extra protection. So we're going to put it in 350-degree oven. It calls for an hour of baking time. I'm going to probably start checking it about 10 minutes early. So I'm going to put it in and set my timer for 50 minutes.
So we are 25 minutes into our cooking time, and I'm going to take a look at the bread. And I'm also going to rotate the bread, flip it, turn it around, so that the half that was in the back, facing the back of the oven, is going to be facing the front of the oven. And part of the reason I'm doing that is because I just have a regular electric oven, and the back part of the oven tends to get a little bit hotter than the front of the oven, in part because the door is there, you've got the seal around the door, heat escaping, things like that. So I'm just going to do that just to kind of help everything cook a little bit more evenly. And I'm also going to see how fast the bread is browning, and am I going to have to be on the lookout for maybe tinting the bread with some foil, grabbing some aluminum foil and just loosely putting it on top of the bread so that the top doesn't burn. So the bread, it's looking great. Flip it around there. But it is looking nice and brown, but I do want to keep an eye on it because I definitely don't want it to burn. So maybe in the next 10 minutes, I may check it again just to see if I need to throw some foil on top. Okay, well, I checked the bread and started using my cake testers, which just toothpicks, sticking it in, pulling it out, and checking for doneness. And I started doing that about 20 minutes away from my first timer, end of my timer. And then I did it about 7 minutes away from the end of my first timer, and it was pretty much done by then. So here is, and I'm going to show you some close-ups as well, but here is the bread. I did end up tinning it with some foil that I just loosely placed over the top like that. It's just to help deflect some of that heat coming from that top heating element. So the bread is pretty much done. So I'm going to get it out of the pan and show you guys.
Okay, so I did just want to go over the cake testers. I just kind of wanted to show you a little bit up close. This is my first tester, and you can see the batter was still really moist and stuck to the toothpick. And then I let about, that was at, let's see, about 35 minutes into cooking. And then I let it go about 7 minutes more, and this was so about 43 minutes into cooking. And you can see there's just a few crumbs. You could really take it out then. I let it go for about 2 minutes more, and there's pretty much nothing on this one. So at this level, this is what you're looking for. Maybe a few crumbs are sticking to it. That's totally fine. But you definitely don't want to see any wet batter. So if you see wet batter, keep it in. But you can see the difference going from here to here in about 7 minutes. That passes pretty quickly. And you're talking about this recipe called for an hour of cooking time, and mine came out in 43 minutes, 45 minutes here. So if we had just let it go at the whole hour and trusted the recipe blindly, you know, we would probably be unhappy with the results. And that's nothing to discredit the recipe. It's just there's a lot of variation in oven temperature and things like that. And I used Greek yogurt instead of sour cream. Greek yogurt is strained, so a lot of the liquid is out of it. You know, sour cream is thinner, has more liquid, so that could have contributed to it. There's a whole host of things. So it's, you know, you can't completely assume that the recipe is going to work for you exactly as written, just because there's so many variables, and oven temperature just being one of them. So here's the bread, and if you can see, it's starting to pull away from the sides, which is another indication that it's really done. If you want to, you can just kind of run your knife around the sides, but I can already feel when I'm doing this that it is pretty much pulled away from the sides of the pan. It's not sticking at all, which is absolutely something that you're looking for and you want. So I'm just going to get two gloves here, oven mitts, to take this out. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to flip it into one hand and then flip it onto this rack. There we go. Came out beautifully. And then just gently put it here. And I'm just going to let it cool fully on this rack. And then once it's fully cooled, give it a slice and see what it looks like on the inside. But this is a great pan that I really enjoy this brand. It's called USA Pan, and you know, it's made in the USA. You see it's got these ridges, which helps with helping things release from it. It also has a little nonstick coating on it, which helps as well. It doesn't eliminate the need to do things like greasing and flouring your pan, things like that, but I've been really pleased with how things come out of those pans. Okay, so the banana bread has been cooling. Now we're going to give it a slice. Check it out. So let's see here. All right, it's still a little warm, but that is a beautiful, it is moist, it is done, it is tender. That is going to be a great banana bread. Okay, so I have sliced the banana bread and it looks amazing. It could cool for a little bit more. It's still a little warm. When I sliced it, you might have seen a little bit of steam coming off the bread. So this could have cooled down for a little bit. I think I let it cool for about 20 minutes. It could cool for an hour or so. But we have a great result. That's going to go great with a cup of coffee in the morning, or maybe a cup of tea right now. So thank you for joining me on Go Try This at Home. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you now have the courage to give banana bread a try. See you next time.